Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show that profiles the human beings behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, inspiring the future and future creators. And for all those that like really great stories, I'm Ira Pastor, your health and aging ambassador along for this journey. So on the last several shows, we've been spending a lot of time talking to people working on what I refer to as the cutting edge and the bleeding edge as it pertains to various emerging technologies and therapeutic and preventative concepts related to health, diseases, the processes of aging, and so forth. And in doing so, we've had a variety of guests on that are building new things, whether those are bioartificial hearts or kidneys or bionic prostheses or exoskeletons, a variety of very interesting topics. Today, we are going to go a bit beyond the bleeding edge of things into the, what I call, that sounds like science fiction edge of things, but as we all know, what sounded like science fiction decades ago is now reality in many cases. And we're going to be talking about building a synthetic brain. Dr. Alice Parker is Dean's Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the Viterbi School of Engineering at the University of Southern California. With a PhD in electrical engineering from North Carolina State, Dr. Parker specializes in a diverse range of disciplines, including biomimetic neuromorphic circuits, biomimetic stereo vision, retinal and cortical neuromorphic analog circuits, as well as nanotechnology. Dr. Parker has served as the Division Director for Computer Engineering, the Dean of Graduate Studies, and the Vice Provost for Research at University of Southern California. Extensively published, Dr. Parker's current research focuses on the Biomimetic real-time Cortex project, which is based off the National Academy of Engineering's Grand Challenge entitled Reverse Engineering the Brain, basically which is to explore questions if, when, and how an artificial brain could be constructed for so-called whole brain emulation, which include things like emulating the complexity of the individual neuronal computations, constructing systems on the scale of the human brain with billions of neurons and trillions of synapses, connecting these neurons for effective and efficient communication, and implementing the concept of plasticity, the ability of the brain to change and grow as learning processes occur. Dr. Parker, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me. This is a great opportunity to chat about what we're looking at and also the future prospects, because this is the beginning of this great exploration into the brain. It's the new frontier. Space was the old frontier. This is the new frontier, and there's so much to be explored that we're just beginning. And as neuroscientists learn more, we're putting the pieces together and trying to say, okay, given that we know now a little bit more, can we add that to what we already know and try to figure out how to build something that could be brain-like? If you can't build it, you don't understand it. And so that my approach was to do something that I thought was a little toy problem for kind of my senior years as a researcher, and it exploded and turned into something that wasn't a toy problem and wasn't just a little fun thing to do. I've graduated about 8 PhD students now on this project, and it seems to be there's now a worldwide trend. And when I began, there were just a handful of us looking at things that were mostly inspired by what Carver Mead had done at Caltech in the 80s. And so going way back, and I had been following his work from the beginning, and I was a big fan, but it didn't catch on. And then all of a sudden it caught on. And technology has allowed us to look at so many different aspects of this. So I'm looking at 3 dimensions all at the same time, which is kind of difficult because to be an expert in any dimension is difficult. And so I'm kind of thinly educated in a couple of dimensions, and the 3rd dimension I understand pretty well, the circuit dimension. So we're trying to say, if you're playing chess, everybody can memorize chess openings, and there's a bazillion of them. But how do you play the end game in chess? how do you put the moves together, because there are infinite number of possibilities and memorization isn't possible really.
Mm-hmm.
So we're doing something with the brain that is like the end game of chess. We're asking the difficult questions first, because other people have solved what we feel like are the basic questions, and we knew how to build neurons, and we knew how to do some basic things. So we started asking a little bit more complicated questions, and they got more and more complicated as time went on, because the understanding of the brain, as I said, it's just exploded, and so there's many more intricacies. And so the things that we're looking at that I think make us almost unique are how do you get the timing the way that the brain works to work in an electronic system, because the signal timing in the brain is really important. When signals arrive, and when a neuron gets late signals, it tends to ignore them. And so the synchronization, it turns out, not just signals arriving about the same time, but arrived synchronously due to these, or it's cause and effect, we don't know, but the brain waves, the gamma and beta and all the brain waves that are going on. We don't know which is cause and which is effect, but the synchronization is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question of how do the astrocytes play a role? Because the astrocytes are prominent in the brain. There's as many glial cells as there are neurons, or maybe more. Astrocytes are a large population of those. And they seem to be doing some sort of diffuse processing, and they have a role in learning and memory. A paper just came out last week that said astrocytes are playing a role in memory, the communication between parts of the brain and the hippocampus. So we're modeling astrocytes as well. So we're trying to do pieces that seem like the most complex, intricate pieces to explore how the brain learns. And we're building a system that talks to a robotic cat to try to model how the cat will start as an infant and learn to walk. And my colleague in this effort is looking at how the cat learns the mechanical ability and walks and learns to move and walk smoothly. The cortex part is the cat starting out with weak neurons that are just firing randomly. And the random firing, along with the desire for something, a target, either food or something out of curiosity. The cat, with those two stimuli, the cat then starts moving. And when it moves, it generates dopamine, which is a reward. And the dopamine causes the neurons that contributed to that movement to be strengthened. Even if they happened seconds before, there's some memory there of what contributed, and it's very subtle. And so the dopamine then arrives, kind of floods the area, and the neurons that contributed are strengthened. So the cat eventually learns to walk towards a target when there is a signal that says you want something. And so we've injected emotions of desire and fear. And desire we start with, and so the cat learns to walk towards the target of food. And then the emotion of fear is injected, and fear causes the cat to move backward. And so when the cat moves backward, when fear is injected, eventually noise contributes, so that eventually neurons fire and the cat moves backward. And then there's a reward for that, because now you're further away from whatever it was that was causing the fear. And those basic response to those basic emotions is kind of wired in to the way that mammal brains work. And so that's what we're trying to exploit. And so we start with weak neurons, inject emotions, inject noise, because noise kickstarts the whole process. And then when something positive happens, then those neurons remember. And after they are sufficiently strengthened, then fear is injected, and fear causes other neurons to be strengthened. Or maybe the same neurons are strengthened in a different way. Different synapses are strengthened in the same neurons, because eventually you run out of neurons, maybe, but you don't run out of synapses, because there's hundreds of thousands of synapses
Right.
per neuron potentially. So
Sure.
uh, building the hardware to do this is tricky, and it's not clear you could build a system that could learn as much as a human with today's technology.
Talk about that a little bit, if you will, just so for some of us that, especially me, I spend most of my time in sort of the wet and warm world of biology. But you know, there's a lot of information on your work in terms of you know, carbon nanostructures and nanotech and things of this nature. Can you sort of walk through sort of I'm trying to put this in sort of biology context, you know, in the sense, okay, what is required to, at the neuron level, in essence, like what is that synthetic neuron all about? What is it? What is made with? You know, what is the concept there? I'm just trying to equate it to a cell, and then how ultimately, you know, we'll go up from there. But if you could sort of start at that base to walk us through a bit of that, that'd be wonderful.
Okay, so most of our work has involved using a conventional technology, CMOS, that's used in most computers and most phones and everywhere, because it's available, it's easy to simulate, it's easy to fabricate, relatively easy to fabricate. And so we built a lot of circuits, electronic circuits, using that. At the same time, we've done a lot of side investigations into different technologies. And one of the reasons is that potentially nanotechnologies could be smaller. Although CMOS is very small now, we're going to have, in the next generation of CMOS circuits, we will have chips that are about 1 billion transistors per square millimeter. So that's a lot. And people are saying, gee, that's 1 billion neurons. But it's not even 1 billion synapses, because the synapse is a complicated system. So it would take many transistors to build a complicated synapse that could learn. Using memristors, one could build some learning capabilities in with less devices. But for CMOS, it's going to take 100 transistors to build a synapse, possibly, to get in the dopamine and the spike timing dependent plasticity that people conventionally have looked at as plasticity. And so between all of those, but the nanotechnology really comes into play because of two things. The first thing is that the connectivity is so dense in the brain that conventional electronics doesn't support that kind of connectivity. There's not that capability. Our ability to build these massive numbers of transistors on a chip is mind-blowing, but we can't connect them all up in some sort of dense way, the way the brain is connected, because each neuron is connected to, say, 10,000 other neurons in the human cortex. Right. And that connectivity seems to be key to a lot of the capabilities, because it's the communications not just with nearby neurons, but with neurons in other regions of the brain that is going to give us certain capabilities. So there's a connectivity between parts of the brain that are all required together in concert to perform some complex tasks. And so we need to get the connectivity right. And so my first thinking was, in order to get connectivity, we need a three-dimensional technology, a technology that can grow in 3 dimensions, kind of atom up, as they say. We're starting with small pieces and we're building up. And we need carbon nanotubes for that reason, because I can envision building a 3D structure with carbon nanotubes. We can't do that right now, but it's a possibility for the future. Another possibility we've looked at is to build layers of thin film electronics. And we looked at a technology called molybdenum disulfide. A colleague of mine, Han Wang, builds transistors with molybdenum disulfide. And the nice feature of those transistors is that you have extra capabilities, so you can modulate things with external signals. So you could build in the astrocyte modulations and the astrocyte sensing in kind of an integral fashion, because you've got these extra capabilities to monitor and control what the transistors are doing. So you essentially have an extra input. So instead of being a 3-terminal device, it's a 4-terminal device.
Mm-hmm.
So that's given us a lot of capabilities. So we've looked at a number of different nanotechnologies to try to figure out what can give us the density that we would need. And we're not the only ones doing this at this point. There are researchers, a couple of other places, especially MIT and Stanford, that are looking at how do we build multi-layer systems so that we can grow in 3 dimensions. But it seems to be really important. It's not the end game yet.
Sure.
The end game is the plasticity, the changes in connectivity. And that, it seems like a nanotechnology that could grow in 3 dimensions and the devices can be moved around and connected and reconnected under control of some sort of synthetic DNA recipe might tell us how to build a 3-dimensional brain. And that's not here yet. And I didn't expect it would be. I think it's going to be at least another decade before we have anything like that to demonstrate how brains work. But I think it would be a requirement to get the plasticity, because it appears to me that the plasticity and the 3-dimensional connectivity are just so critically important, because the timing is so important. If you have conventional CMOS, then the signaling between parts of even a single chip, the signaling is done through a network. And everybody's used networks. We know that networks have delays. And so as soon as a signal goes out on a network, it takes a while to reach another part of the brain. The brain has already moved on to some other task by the time the signal arrives. So getting the timing right is really complicated. And people who build complex neuromorphic systems now have been working on this, especially the Manchester Spinnaker project by Steve Ferber. And they're running the network as fast as they can, and they're running the neurons at human neural rates so that the network can kind of keep up with the processing speed of the neurons, because the neurons are slow and the network is electronic time, which is a lot faster. So electronic time is nanoseconds and processing time is milliseconds for the neurons. And so you can run a network really fast, and so it doesn't matter if there's some delays, because there's still microsecond delays and we're okay. But and building something that works now seems to be the best solution that I've seen. However, for an actual brain-like device, I think it would be nanotechnologies would give you an edge, because it would be a more natural way to use the technology if we could build in 3 dimensions. So that's why we've been exploring, just to ask, again, the question about the end game, which is how you get to something that is, and the connectivity is changing every day. Well, in your brain, it's changing every day. In my brain, it's changing more slowly. Brains as they age are slower to change, but an adult up to about age 27 is still forming connections at a pretty high rate, higher than people thought. So the connectivity is an important part. And then once the connectivity is established, then the strengthening and weakening of the synapses is occurring minute by minute. And so there's a lot of plasticity, as they call it. There's a lot of changes that are going on. And for learning and memory, it's really important to capture all that in some sort of electronic system. And you could capture it all with software. Software can do anything. You can mimic anything. The problem is, right now, it would take a massive supercomputer to do a piece of the human brain. So
what your group has obviously been involved in during the Cortex project, you've been involved in a lot of these firsts in the sense of demonstrating, the effect on the astrocytes, on the transmission, and, you were the first to implement dendritic plasticity in neuromorphic circuits. So, I mean, you're really leading sort of these new, these exponential steps in the process. What are the next steps? I mean, I think, I once again, I put my biology hat on, in the way sort of things emerge, and, the emergent systems, the way cells glom together and form tissues and so forth. Are we waiting on new technologies that are coming the next decade, or are those technologies here and they're very expensive? Like, what's the next step? It's completely fascinating. I just, once again, it's someone who doesn't have electrical engineering experience. What's next? Like, what's next in this? Like, to get to some of those next hurdles that you foresee.
This idea of atom up building, where you start and you assemble the devices and the connections between devices and all of that. That's something that is just emerging.
Okay.
And so that could be happening. People are looking at all sorts of nanotechnologies right now. Not for neuromorphics necessarily, but at USC, we happen to have a small group of individuals who are looking at neuromorphics and looking at nanotechnologies. And so that's happening. But I haven't seen a breakthrough yet. Okay. But I know that that's not far away, because people are working on it.
Got it.
What I see happening that I think is in my group that is the most interesting is that the signaling for a long time was just thought to be ones and zeros. And that was the kind of conventional wisdom that people used who built systems to model the brain, not the neuroscientists, but the people building these systems. And then people started saying, well, having spike rates might be important. And it turns out that in the neuroscience that's emerging, it's not just the spike rate, but the spike shape is giving information. And there's a group at Bar Ilan in Israel who's looking at spike shapes and triggering a spike from one side of a neuron causes a spike that has a very spiky shape. And from the other side of the neuron, the other side of the dendritic arbor, it triggers spikes that have a kind of long tail. That is probably due to calcium. And so we're building neurons that have spike rates that indicate something about the origin of the signal and the meaning of the signal. And also we're building neurons that spike with different shapes, because the signaling tells us information that might be used downstream. So if, for example, you remap a rat's barrel cortex because one of the whiskers is clipped, the other neurons in the barrel cortex that were processing that whisker start processing remaining whiskers. It all gets remapped. If you damage somebody's brain due to a stroke, the connections start using existing neurons, surviving neurons, to do the same functions that the connections were broken in. So we're looking at how do you signal that? How do you signal the overlay of function onto existing neurons, and maybe the spiking is different in some way. And so we're looking at the information theory of what the spikes mean, the neural code.
Okay.
Would speak to what your background is. We're looking at the neural code. And by doing that, it's complicated because it's like the blind men and the elephant. Everybody's looking at a piece and they're saying the elephant's like a wall, no, the elephant's like a rope, and so forth. And so we take all these pieces and somehow weave them together in some sort of story that makes our electronic neurons work. And it might not be exactly the way the brain does it, because the knowledge is just emerging. But we're taking those pieces and trying to say, how does that code give us something more than just this neuron is sending a 1 to that neuron and saying, I'm spiking, and then the neuron that receives that information spikes and doesn't say, I got the information from neuron A and not from neuron B. How do we know that? And so that's all the neural coding that's got to get kind of folded into any system. So that's what we're working on.
Fascinating.
And that is, I think, one of the toughest problems. And one PhD student has been working on that for a couple of years, and is the idea for the thesis is kind of emerging exactly what he's going to show in one dissertation, because we can only do so much with each dissertation.
Surely.
So
what, if you and I, were to get in my hypothetical time machine over here and go out 50 years or whatever, and be sitting in front of a biomimetic real-time Cortex machine and turn it on, what is your vision for what these machines will be able to do for us in the coming centuries, millennia? I mean, what does a fully functional synthetic neuromorphic computer capable of, in your opinion? And go in any direction here. I mean, I'm fascinated to its possibilities.
I think we wouldn't turn it on because it would be on all the time.
I won't do that.
Because, we don't want it to forget anything. I mean, presumably everything that would be archived and stored as you turn it off, but there's a lot of intricate state information that has to be preserved. And right now we don't have the capability of doing that, so it would be on all the time, presumably.
Okay.
But I think that
and I don't mean to interrupt. I don't interrupt 1 second. The only reason I'm asking this question is we hear so much about the topic of, say, quantum computing nowadays. I sort of want to put this in perspective of, is this machine 1 million times more powerful than that? 1 billion times? What are we looking at here? Because, some people will tell you the most powerful supercomputers today can't give you a worm. What is the real power and potential of something like this?
I think that within several decades, we could have something that behaved enough like a human brain that it could be successful in, say, driving a car under a lot of different circumstances. So it would behave like a young adult human brain, which is a lot. We could behave like a maturing human brain much more quickly, but the learning wouldn't be the point that you would want to give it the experience that an adult driver has. But I'm very interested in autonomous vehicles, and we did a DARPA challenge years ago, getting a car to drive itself. So I think that something that can apply judgment in complex circumstances with complex sensor data. And this is where the sensor information is kind of killing us right now. I don't want to mention Boeing aircraft, but we're having troubles with sensor data.
Right.
So sensor information is critically important, and fog, rain, darkness, sun glare, all sorts of things get in the way of an autonomous vehicle driving itself, but people somehow manage to interpret the data regardless. And this is a frontier that the autonomous community is working on right now, is how to drive through fog. And there are a lot of results emerging. So yeah, so I think, but I think something like that, where being able to deal with complex situations would be interesting. What I would really like to see is, I would like to see the systems being able to explain themselves. And this is something that is very difficult to do with neural networks, for example. A neural network can't tell you why it arrived at an answer. The neurons we're building, there'll be these little pieces of information getting dragged along in the way of spike shapes or spiking frequencies or spiking patterns, little pieces that somehow indicate why a neuron spiked. and what the origin of the information was. We're just beginning that. But the question is, can you build systems that have more awareness of their own functioning, so that an answer would be explained in some way? Well, I put these two pieces together and then I added this, and this is why I got the answer I got. And so I noted that I remembered seeing this before, and I saw that, and then I have this neuron that says, if this is true, then that is true. And so, you get some sort of an answer, and that it's not consciousness in the philosophical sense, but it's an ability to monitor and analyze what's going on in the system so that there can be some explanation.
Sure.
I mentioned the C word because some level of self-awareness is important, but maybe not the level that philosophers would say was consciousness, because I think consciousness is like seeing a shape in a cloud. You reach in, but there's nothing there.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult concept to work on or to deal with. But dealing with a system that is aware of its own reasoning might be highly useful.
Right. So. Yeah, it's funny you brought that up, because my next question was, I had some notes here on folks like Christoph Koch and Giulio Tonini, and they have this integrated information theory of consciousness. And while I'm by no means an expert in this space, a lot of it comes down to if the system is complex enough, does consciousness potentially in some form arise? And I know it's not right. It's not what you want to focus on, but obviously there's going to be a lot of people thinking, well, if you can make a system that is that, good at thinking and understanding, and then can relay why it's done something, have you created, although maybe not as conscious as we may be here, have you opened the curtain into a whole other domain of knowledge and exploration that it may be somewhat of a side effect to everything, but still a major challenge for, that's why it's called the hard problem. Are you cracking the hard problem at the same time with this research?
I think everything we do is going to contribute to cracking that problem, but it's a long way away.
Sure.
And I think that it's complicated by the fact that there are systems that do things, and then there's systems in the brain that are analyzing what's being done. And we're not building any of those right now. We're building the systems that do things.
Right.
And there's layers above it. And it's going to take a while, but at some point, somebody will look at what's going on and say, yeah, that's starting to look like self-awareness. That's starting to look like the glimmers of consciousness. But it will only emerge, I believe, if we capture the complexity of the brain in some way. And right now, I kind of feel like we're at the beginnings. And so I don't think that the complexity is where we want it to be. The thing that I would work on if I were 2 decades younger and we're going to pursue a big problem, the thing I would work on would be looking at how the DNA is expressed, how it expresses the RNA that causes proteins to be expressed, that changes not only the behavior, but the structure of neurons. Because it appears to me that in the epigenetics, that all the little bits attached to the DNA that are extra, it appears to me that all of that is extremely important in understanding how the brain works and how human behavior works. And so that somehow has got to be looked at, and it's complicated. But there are ways to do a first order approximations. You could do very, very simple kinds of genetic instructions that make a neuron become pyramidal neuron versus becoming an interneuron in the spinal cord, you can do some basics that they look very different. But you know, a retinal neuron that doesn't even spike. So they're basics that you could do, but I think it would be a long time before we get that answer. But that seems to be important in terms of how the brain decides to connect and strengthen and control what's going on. And so it seems to me like that'd be a deep dive to do as a younger person to try to mimic in some way what's going on. And all we can do is mimic at this point. If we had some sort of a wet biology kind of circuit, then maybe it would be more complicated, but the biochemistry of the brain, as you know, is so complicated. I don't think that mimicking it exactly, that we would ever be able to do that, because it's just enormously complicated. And the question is, would we want to? When we have billions of human brains alive on the planet, why would we need to build something that was exactly like a human? The other thing that I've always been interested in is how to build in somehow the moral code. And there's some explanations to the moral code that have to do with which regions of the brain are altruistic, how the survival of the species turns out to be an important drive, and is maybe a stronger drive in some cases than survival of the self. And so it's possible that, you know, some of that is neurologically based. We can tease it out, and tying that in with mirror neurons, so that people see somebody suffering and then they feel bad too. Could a robot have some mirror neurons that say, gee, this person is suffering now and I moved forward, maybe I should stop. Maybe I ran over this person's foot. And he's screaming. So we're looking at that right now. We're adding in some extra neurons that are like mirror neurons that are causing the same input of pain to come in to the neural network that would come in if the robot were experiencing some sort of damage, and would be an alarm signal. And so hearing a person scream would be a similar signal, and it would cause the robot to freeze. So that's the project we're doing right now. It's a little toy example of something that's very complicated, and we're just saying, let's just build a little simple thing and see what we can get with it.
That's where you have to start. And the fact that you started you've made so much progress on this, and you're laying the groundwork for, you know, armies of PhDs in the coming decades to continue. And it's amazing. It's fascinating. And not having the expertise in electrical engineering, it's just, you know, it sounds like science fiction, but it's amazing. It's incredible stuff.
But it's simplifying things really down to a very crude level in order to build something, to show an example. And so we're leaving out a lot, and we have to. But I became fearless when I got to a certain stage in my career, and I had, you know, become a fellow of the IEEE, which is kind of okay. And so then I thought, you know, I'm really bored with what I'm doing, and the brain is fascinating, and people are saying we can build an artificial brain in 10 years. And I thought, I'm going to prove them wrong. I'm going to show how hard this really is. And it was just kind of out of a, okay, I don't like all the hype. I'm going to jump in and do something really complicated that shows the layers. And so first it was just a reaction to say, okay, this is not so easy. And this is why. And I'm fearless, because why not? Yeah, there's an old saying, you know, you're on this merry-go-round. It used to be called a carousel, you know, carnival ride. And there's a brass ring hanging on this pole, and the first person around the ride who grabs the brass ring gets a prize. And so the old saying is, you got to grab the brass ring when it goes around, because you won't get another chance. Somebody will have already grabbed it. And so I looked and I said, gee, why not? There's only a handful of people in the world looking at this, at least according to the search engines in 2005. There were only a small number of people looking at this. And there's exponential growth now in terms of how many people are looking at this. But I grabbed the brass ring and said, okay, let's just start looking. Let's start playing with ideas.
Right.
So that's, that it's just, there was nothing to lose. Why not?
Why not? Exactly.
Why not?
Dr. Parker, coming back to you now, I mean, fascinating work you're doing. Obviously, you've had an amazing career to date. You've met a lot of fascinating people, no doubt. Are there certain people along that path over the last few decades, in terms of influencers, people that have guided you, kept you on this path, that you know, if it wasn't for them, you know, you would have gone and done something totally different with your career? Really, anyone you want to give a shout out to in terms of sort of that part of your scientific life?
Well, besides Carver Mead, who at Caltech really laid the groundwork for this, and his the student he worked with, Misha Mayawald, who looked at retinal neurons. Besides that, I think that the work that was done by Kwabena Boahan at Stanford was instrumental. The work that I think we followed the most closely has been the work by Jennifer Hassler at Georgia Tech.
Okay.
And Jennifer Hassler's work, the way that she goes about solving problems, that's been instrumental, even though what we do it looks very different. But if you compare, if people within the field would compare, they would say that we're closer to that than to what other people are doing. That was a model from the beginning. But I think that the work, who else? That's a difficult question. One of the models was definitely the work done at the NIH on the astrocytes. Okay. By Doug Fields. That was instrumental in opening my eyes to the other brain and all of that. Neuroscientists like Kandel, Henry Markram. Sure. Those people kind of fundamental research that opened my eyes to, okay, this is interesting and something that I want to pursue.
That's a nice list, a nice interdisciplinary list. So it's
because I look at a lot of different things.
Sure. It's a multifactorial problem. So clearly, you need this different types of input, and you sound like you have a lot of the right ecosystem.
But the biggest inspiration, probably from the beginning, was this textbook that's still a textbook called Psychology in Life. It's an undergraduate textbook that's used in courses to teach psychology to people who are going to become music teachers and whatever. It's a broad book. But I read that book when I was about 11 years old because my mother was taking the class. And I said, this is really interesting. And so that kind of kick-started it. And my father was a biochemist. Okay. And that interest in the biology of things kind of kick-started that. And so the combination of the two is really kind of pushed me in the direction I've gone.
Very nice. Very nice. Final question, and this is, you can take your time with this one a little bit if you need to. So that this, we a couple of questions ago, you and I took a trip to the future in our time machine. Now I want to give you that time machine to go elsewhere. This is about the scientist, or it can be a scientist, it can be an artist, a philosopher, whomever, that Dr. Alice Parker would have liked to have met sometime in the past, who would that person be for you? And if you had that opportunity to go meet them, who would that be, and what would you want to talk to that person about? You can take your time with that one. Think it through.
Probably Leonardo da Vinci.
Ah.
Because of the kind of wide range of capabilities he had,
Mm-hmm.
and the wide range of interest. And I'm deeply interested in how people's brains work and how different they are. And in identifying, okay, that person has to have certain traits that maybe somebody would call by a certain label. And, but actually, I think that the people who have behaved in a different way than the norm are the people that interest me the most. In terms of scientists, I think Albert Einstein definitely had a very different brain than the norm. Jane Goodall, I've met and several times and spent a little bit of time with, and I am deeply impressed by how differently she thinks about things. And so that's more the kind of person that I would like to meet Greta Thunberg.
Okay.
Because I want to talk to her a little bit and to see, again, how her mind works, because she is fearless.
Sure.
And how do you get that sense of fearlessness into somebody that young? I try to give my students something of that, to the freedom to unleash and to do what they should be thinking about, and to be fearless, because there's no cost. Nobody's going to come and take away your life for having come up with a stupid idea. But come up with a stupid idea, because sometimes stupid ideas turn into something groundbreaking. And
that's the case.
And if you don't, the life you live is a life that is less interesting. Might be successful. You might have 300, papers on your CV when you're 30 years old, but people aren't going to be saying in 100 years, yeah, gee, that was groundbreaking work.
Right.
So I think that's the secret sauce I'd like to give people, and to meet people who have that, and to try to tease it out and understand why they do things the way they do. That, I think that's the fun part of doing the research, is what is so different about these brains, and why we might be seeing, we see evolution and we just can't see it because we're too close to it. But the human brain is evolving, and is part of that evolution a brain that is able to put pieces together that other brains couldn't, and to look into the future. And I think that that's an interesting question. Is it a hyper brain? And what are these people? How are these brains constructed? Yeah. So that's more what I'm interested in. I'm interested in people and how they think, and not just how an ion channel opens and closes. That's all interesting, but it's not quite of the same level of interest.
Right. Fascinating. Yeah. Outstanding response. It's a great set of folks, and I completely agree with that. That it's the people that have put it on the line, and it's not about, as you said, the 300 papers, but the one really unique idea that changes things. So, and I definitely, I think what you're doing is one of those major ideas. It's completely outstanding, and just as we say on the show, it's all about moving the story forward, the human story forward, and you're definitely doing that in major ways. And just thanking you for not just sharing your knowledge and your insight on the show, but for everything you're doing to move this theme and chapter forward that I hope I'm around when it happens too, and see this, because it's transformational. So, once again, really thanking you. For everybody that's going to be watching or listening on the radio stations, we've been spending time with Dr. Alice Parker, Dean's Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the Viterbi School of Engineering, University of Southern California, doing truly amazing things, reverse engineering the human brain, biomimetic neuromorphic circuits, nanotechnology, really creating the future for all of us, one step at a time. Dr. Parker, it's been a pleasure spending time with you, and thank you for everything you've been doing.
Thank you for the invitation. This was a great chat, and thank you for appreciating the nuances of why I'm doing what I'm doing and how different it is.
It's been a pleasure, and I try to ask the right questions, although it's in a tangential domain to mine, but really, really wonderful stuff. So thank you for the time.